Hello there, very good evening. Time then for the press preview. It's our first look at the front pages of Monday's papers, and tonight we'll see what's making the headlines with the Spectator's economics editor, Kate Andrews, who's joined by the columnist and broadcaster Steve Richards. Very good evening to both of you. And now, as you can imagine, the papers have all had to change their front pages extremely quickly. I think we can bring you the front page of The Guardian at least. Let's show you the front of The Guardian. Have we got that? It's coming. Yeah, a bit of a nightmare for newspaper editors, isn't it, when news breaks just after 9 o'clock on a Sunday. But there you are, the front of The Guardian. Not the right time. Johnson out of race to lead the Tories. The Guardian quoting from Boris Johnson's statement of an hour and a half or so ago. Well, let's get the thoughts of our paper reviewers this evening. Steve and Kate, great to see you. And what an evening it has been. Kate, let's come to you first. Were you surprised by this news?
Well, I suppose I'm surprised by everything these days. I'm surprised we're having another Tory leadership contest. You know, it all adds up. But I think there's a lot to break down in the statement that Boris Johnson put out this evening. Number one, he seemed extremely confident, not only in his prospects that he could win and be the prime minister again next week, but that he could actually lead the Tories to another general election victory. He also insisted that he did have the number of nominations to get himself onto that ballot, but decided that it was his choice not to run because he didn't think it was the right time and he didn't think he could bring the Conservative MPs together. The word he used was unity at this time. We will never know if Boris Johnson had enough MPs to get onto the ballot. There was a lot of speculation about that today. There were a lot of briefings, most anonymous, suggesting that Boris Johnson was having more frustration getting to that figure, but Boris and his backers insisted that they were going to have it. I imagine that this is a very difficult moment for the Prime Minister because we all know he didn't want to leave Downing Street just weeks ago, that he felt ousted, that he still feels like that mandate is his. But I think it was becoming very clear that Boris just could not command the support of his MPs anymore. So even if he could command the support of grassroots members and get himself back into the job, the situation would fundamentally be untenable. And rather than putting himself on the ballot and going through that process, or perhaps experiencing a great humiliation by not getting on the ballot at all, he decided to release a statement tonight and try to claim some control over the situation, to say that it was his decision, not anybody else's.
Yeah, Steve, front of the Metro, their headline, Boris has bottled it. Ex-PM claims 102 nominations, then quits. I mean, that is the big question, isn't it? If he had the number of MPs, and of course we'll never actually know because only Sir Graham Brady will know for sure whether he reached that 102. If he says that he has the backing of the Tory party members, and we know that many of them do support still Boris Johnson, he could have gone for it, but he is saying that he's putting his personal ambitions to one side for the sake of the party. Do you believe that?
That makes me laugh, that last bit. I think we've seen a manifestation of personal ambition in the most unrestrained and preposterous way from him over recent days. Here's someone who couldn't form a government in July, who rationalised his moment had come once again a few weeks later. And he's sort of been a disruptive force in this kind of mad mini leadership contest that's going on. So I don't believe that. I'm not sure whether he was 100% sure he had reached this 100 plus threshold. But the statement is very interesting and disingenuous. He said, I tried to bring us all together in conversations with Penny Mordaunt and Rishi Sunak, but it didn't come off. What he really means is he asked them to back him to be Prime Minister and they would all form a team. He wasn't offering to be Northern Ireland Secretary for Rishi Sunak. And then at the end, he says, I've got a lot more to offer, but not now. Now, that translates as I still want to be Prime Minister, and that's what I've got to offer. It didn't work for me today. So I think to be honest, this might hurt him more than when he was booted out in July, because I think he rationalised then it was Sunak and a couple of others conspiring against him. But now he's come up against the harsh reality that MPs beyond his devotees were not flocking to him as he rushed back from his holiday to save his party and his country as he probably saw it.
Yeah, front page of The Sun, Kate Sunak set to be next MP. Bojo it to no. Boris steps aside to avoid chaos. You've touched on this already, but what do you think is going to happen tomorrow? Do you think it will be a Sunak coronation? Is that a given now? Because the big question, I suppose, is where does that support for Boris Johnson go? Because if a lot of it went to Penny Mordaunt, she could feasibly cross the line.
It's really difficult to know, and anything is feasible at this point. Boris Johnson has about 60 publicly declared backers, but remember, there are dozens of MPs who have not come out and said who they're supporting at all yet. So there is still all to play for. The first obvious question is if Penny Mordaunt can get to the 100 MPs she needs, because if she can't, then it's a done deal for Rishi Sunak. But let's say she were just to scrape 100 MPs, maybe say got 105. At that point, what would the pressure from the Tory party be put upon Penny Mordaunt to say, are you really going to take us through this week? Are you really going to send that ballot to the members? She may well decide she's going to, but at that point, you would expect probably some kind of conversation to take place between Rishi Sunak and Penny Mordaunt. And I think a very good point was made there that Boris Johnson was never really trying to bring the three of them together. He was suggesting that they could get in line behind him. And of course, Boris Johnson is very used to that. He got used to in his premiership having MPs support him in very difficult, usually quite personal situations in which the cabinet had to come out and defend the prime minister's actions, scandal after scandal related to Partygate in particular. And I think it was probably quite a shock to Boris Johnson that this time round, Penny Mordaunt and Rishi Sunak did not get behind him. But again, if you look at the numbers, why would you necessarily? Penny Mordaunt thinks, I've got just as good a shot as you do, Boris, and Rishi's sitting there with double the number of MPs publicly backing him than Boris has. Jeremy Hunt, just in the past few minutes, has come out and support Rishi Sunak, of course, the Chancellor now, and notably was more or less promised by Penny Mordaunt that he would remain Chancellor if she got the nomination. Sorry, if she got the top job. So the fact that he's actually come out to back Rishi Sunak is very good news for the former Chancellor tonight. But no, of course, there's still all to play for. And if Penny Mordaunt does get those 100 MPs, she may well decide she wants there to be a membership vote. And let's remember, that might not be the worst news for Rishi Sunak. Again, a lot of people just want there to be a new prime minister so that he or she can get on with the job. But Rishi's biggest problem at the moment is that he was rejected by the membership, albeit by a closer margin than people thought it would be, just weeks ago. And it might not be the worst thing in the world if he was back on the ballot and the members actually voted him in, because then he would have that clear mandate from the grassroots, which at the moment, if he's the only one to get 100 plus MPs, he wouldn't be able to say with confidence.
Yeah, you mentioned that article in the Telegraph written by Jeremy Hunt. We've just managed to pull it up. With Rishi Sunak, we have someone who, in our best traditions, will turn the page on what went wrong, take decisions in the national interest and rebuild the extraordinary potential of our economy. Voters of all parties know this perfectly well. They're hoping and praying we choose wisely. We must not let them down. So the Chancellor backing Rishi Sunak. But he is a divisive figure, isn't he, Steve?
Well, yes. I mean, in the sense that some of Boris Johnson's fans kind of blame him for what happened to Boris Johnson in July. But as I say, that was always irrational and wrong. And maybe Boris Johnson himself will come to realise that in the light of this weekend's events. He's divisive in a different way. I mean, he is a self-declared fiscal conservative. I've read in recent days that if they elect Sunak rather than Johnson, it will be a move to the centre ground, to the left of the Tory party. He is a self-declared kind of Thatcherite. So that's not the case. Economically, in his haphazard way, Johnson was to the left of Rishi Sunak. So it could be divisive in the sense that the Hunt-Sunak axis will be very fiscally conservative, kind of try and adopt that culture of balancing the books in a sort of George Osborne-esque way. And that will involve some very tough decisions. But I've never understood why the so-called right of the party sort of said, Sunak, he's appalling, he's a socialist. I mean, it was a part of the craziness of this period that he was framed in such a way.
Yeah, you make an interesting point there. And if we bring in the Sunak favourite for number 10 after Tory MPs force Johnson to quit, they mention, Kate, that Boris Johnson lost support of Suella Braverman, also Steve Baker today, who came out to support Rishi Sunak.
I think this will have been part of the calculation for Boris Johnson to pull his name tonight, because it was very clear that the so-called right of the party was splitting. It was not going to back Boris Johnson. And when Suella Braverman, Steve Baker, and then others who wouldn't have had a vote but are very influential figures like David Frost were coming out for Rishi Sunak, there was a real sense that something was changing. It's also interesting to note the final comments in Boris Johnson's statement tonight, where he says, "I have a lot to give, but this isn't the moment." It reminded me of the column that heavyweight conservative columnist Charles Moore wrote over the weekend for The Telegraph, in which he basically said, "Boris, I think you're fantastic, but this is not your moment. This is an economic crisis, and we need the economics guy, the Rishi Sunak character, to come in and fix it." And I thought it was interesting that that language was repeating itself, and perhaps that was part of the message that was relayed to the former prime minister over the weekend, which is, a lot of his supporters will always like him and see the good that they think he did for the country, but this is simply not the moment. And perhaps that messaging cut through. And then just lastly, I think it's such an important point that's been made about the so-called left and right of the Conservative Party. It was a baffling definition over the summer, because all of a sudden being the one to want to balance the books became to the left of the party. And I think the reason Rishi Sunak, they tried to label him as the left of the party, was because he had raised taxes. But of course, we know that he was raising taxes because he was so worried about inflation and the state of the public finances and losing market confidence, which has become the reason that we're having another leadership election.
Yeah.
I thought that Jeremy Hunt's comments when he spoke last Monday were actually very Sunak-esque in style. So I can't say I'm terribly surprised that he has come out for the former Chancellor tonight.
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting, isn't it, seeing how the markets react to this news. Welcome back. You're watching part two of the press preview. Kate Andrews and Steve Richards are still with us. Front page of the Times. Steve, Sunak set for number 10 as Johnson quits race. Interestingly, they quote Nadhim Zahawi here, the Cabinet Office Minister, who, of course, endorsed Boris Johnson this morning, but tonight tweeted, given today's news, it's clear that we should turn to Rishi Sunak. It just shows how quickly things change.
It shows what, to put it at its most polite, an unreliable narrator he is. And his tweet tonight, on Twitter, basically roughly translated is, "Oh, sorry, Rishi, I got all this a bit wrong. Do give me a job in the cabinet," And politics can be a really noble vocation, and it can be utterly humiliating. And I think he has, with his behaviour actually in recent weeks, really humiliated himself. But it's a sign that the momentum, I know it's a cliche, but momentum really does matter in these very short contests, is with Sunak. That you've had Jeremy Hunt coming out for him, you've had him coming out for him, having declared for Boris Johnson, and there will probably be a bit more of that in the coming hours.
Looking at the Daily Telegraph, Kate, we know Jeremy Hunt has written for the Telegraph supporting Rishi Sunak. But there's also a piece here by Camilla Tominey, headline, "Don't be fooled into thinking the psychodrama is over."
Well, that she could have anything in that piece because there's so many directions that this could go. She's a brilliant writer. I'm sure it's a very insightful one. And it's not over. Rishi Sunak is not yet declared the leader of the Conservative Party or the Prime Minister. Penny Mordaunt may well get over the threshold. She may get 100 plus MPs. She may decide she wants that ballot to go to the membership so that she can have her chance. So this contest is not over. But because it's short, we're going to know either tomorrow or on Friday who the next prime minister will be, and the huge challenges ahead of them, the huge economic crisis that we now find ourselves in, the desperation to get the markets back on side. This is the real challenge, and it's interesting to look at the polling over the past few days, because it is very clear that Rishi Sunak commands more attention when it comes to the economy, that there's far more trust in him than there has been in the other candidates. But this is at the moment a battle between Tory MPs and then the Tory grassroots, and they're going to be looking at a whole host of things. And so the contest is certainly not over yet.
Yeah, Camilla Tominey, I think, was focusing on Boris Johnson. She says in this piece, like all good headline acts, he decided to keep the audience waiting in the sort of will he, won't he guessing game that's come to characterise his entire political career. You can read more about that in the Telegraph. Here's a paper we don't feature very often, Steve. City AM. It's the business paper for London that's handed out in the morning. Boris, not this time, their headline. A picture of Boris Johnson there with his head in his hands. And we're focusing on this this, really, because it shows that all papers have had to do this last-minute change, and it is fascinating how the front page can change and sometimes has to change very quickly.
It's really interesting as well in this kind of new media era. I mean, a few years ago, this would have been a nightmare for newspapers who would have to, actually a lot of their physical copies would not have been able to be updated in time. But now, in a way, they're closer with these digital editions. I assume, have you got digital front pages? I don't know whether it's the physical newspaper or digital, but assuming it's digital, they can move much more quickly these days. I mean, it's almost like rolling news, not as fast as you, obviously, because you can get it out immediately to viewers, but they can move so much more quickly than in that pre-digital era, where they would, the first editions would have gone long ago and people would have been buying the physical newspapers with speculation about, whether Johnson was going to win or not. So that's, the good thing for newspapers, they're struggling in many respects, is this kind of digital dimension.
That's right. Steve, Kate, thank you both very much.